So a habitat study. So in this lesson we're going to look at a topic in biology called ecology. So we're going to look at what ecology is all about, and we're going to look at how to conduct and do what's called a habitat study. So the aim in this section is that students should be able to conduct a habitat study, research and investigate the adaptations, competition, and interdependence of organisms within specific habitats and communities. So we're going to look at each of these terms and talk about what they mean and talk about what is meant by conducting a habitat study. So this area topic, what it's about is ecology. We're going to think about what ecology is. So ecology really is a branch of biology that looks at living organisms and how they basically interact within their environment and what they do and their behaviors and how the environment affects them. So have a look at this. Okay, so pause the video and have a look at this and think about this was an observation that was made by scientists in of birds' nests in urban areas. And what they found was that birds were starting to use cigarette butts or cigarette filters to line their nests like this. So what I want you to do is come up with a theory as to why you think the birds were doing this, okay? And whatever your theory is, come up with some evidence to back it up. Okay, so what your theory is and why you believe that to be true or why that to be the case. And this is a problem that was posed by that some ecologists faced, and they had to come up with some kind of solution or some kind of reasoning as to why birds were doing this, carrying out this particular type of behavior. So pause the video, think about why the birds are doing this, and come up with a theory, and then back up your answer with some evidence. Okay, so let's have a look. So think about your theory, and we'll actually go and look and see why the birds were doing this. So a study was carried out. So it was carried out by this guy here, and he was part of a university in Mexico. And his colleagues, they spent several years studying this behavior of birds using cigarette butts to line their nests. Okay, and they looked at finches, for example, a particular type of bird. And what they found is that birds use cigarette butts as chemical warfare against ticks. So if you think about the birds that were nesting here, so they lay their eggs, the eggs hatch, and you have the baby chicks. So those baby chicks are exposed to ticks that are in the environment. So think about if you have a pet, like a cat, for example, and particularly when you start to come into the summertime, when they go outside, ticks attach onto them, and those ticks basically they live off. They need an animal to live off. So generally, what you do for your pet is you'll get tick remover, or you'll inoculate them against ticks so that when the tick bites them, they'll die. The tick will die. So what was happening was birds were basically they were using the cigarette butts, which would have had the used cigarette butts, which would have had small amounts of nicotine in the filter. And nicotine is the a chemical that's in cigarettes that makes them addictive. And nicotine is like ticks hate nicotine, and basically it's a poison to ticks. And what it does is it actually repels ticks and stops them getting into the nest. So it kind of acts like a barrier, if you like. So the birds were using cigarette butts for chemical warfare against ticks. So what they were doing was they're trying to keep their chicks safe and putting up this barrier of cigarette butts that contain nicotine in it. And what that was doing was repelling ticks from entering into the nest and feeding on the young chicks. So I'd encourage you to pause the video and have a read down through this. And this kind of talks about the study that was carried out. And this kind of gives you an idea of if you were an ecologist, for example, or a scientist that studies these particular areas, these are the kind of things that you would be doing. So you'd be looking at organisms. In this case, we have birds and ticks. and you'd be looking at how they interact within a habitat. So a habitat, for example, is where these organisms live, and you would be looking at things like relationships between the organisms. So within this community, you have the birds, and you also have the ticks, and how they interact with each other, and how they depend and interdepend on each other as well. So this is the area of ecology, and this is kind of like what it looks at. So if we take habitat then, so we've used this word habitat, so we want to kind of think about what it means. So a habitat is the natural environment where a particular organism lives. And normally organisms don't live on their own, let's say within a particular habitat. They live as part of what's known as a community. So a community is all the animals and plants that live in a particular area or habitat and share the resources in that area. So it's important that you know these two definitions, um, and you're able to explain what a habitat is and what a community is. So if we have a look here, so this is a drawing or a sketch of different animals, for example, from Ireland, or different, what we would, from a scientific point of view, we would refer to them as organisms. So each one of these particular organisms will have a unique habitat that they live in, and that habitat will provide for all their needs. So they need shelter, they need food, they need warmth, protection from the elements, and they need to be able to find a mate. So in their habitat, all of these things will be provided for them. Now, what will happen is these animals will live as part of a community, and all of the particular organisms will all be competing for resources within that community. So that's what we mean when we talk about a habitat. That's like what a habitat is. And a community, when we talk about a community, again, organisms live within a community, they don't live in isolation. And then if we focus in more, let's say, on particular organisms, what we will notice is that organisms, they live in their habitat, but they're perfectly evolved and adapted to live in that particular habitat. So what enables them to live in that habitat are what are known as adaptations. So, for example, specific organisms will prefer to live in particular environments. So if you think on it like a very extreme one, if you take polar bears, for example, polar bears like to live in cold regions. They have adaptations, they have thick skin that allows them to keep in heat, and it enables them to survive, for example, in polar or like sub-zero conditions. Now, if you were to take those same, so that would kind of be their habitat. If you were to take those same organisms and you were to take a polar bear and put it into a desert, for example, the polar bear isn't adapted to live in that particular environment. So what will happen is the polar bear will not be able to cool down, and that same adaptation of having like that particular thick hide that enables it to keep in heat, that would become a hindrance to the organism. And what would happen is the organism would die, like the polar bear would die because it wouldn't be able to cool down. So again, this is like how organisms rely on their particular habitat and how the habitat has an impact on the particular organism as well. So these things that so what enables organisms to survive are these things called adaptations. So if we look at two kind of types of adaptations that are very common. So if we take the red squirrel, so red squirrel are they're a native Irish squirrel that are native to Ireland. So red squirrels are well adapted to living in woodlands. So their habitat is a woodland area, and having large eyes and long hind limbs adapted for leaping. So if we take two adaptations that squirrels have, they have large eyes. Okay, so they need these large eyes because what they do is they spend their time moving around through trees and they move between trees. And also as well, they have these really big hind limbs, and these limbs are like very muscular, and what they do is they enable the squirrel to be able to hop from tree to tree to tree. Okay, and the vision then that they have because of these large eyes enable them to be able to move fairly quickly between trees. And again, these are two specific adaptations that a red squirrel has, and those adaptations enable the red squirrel to live very comfortably within its natural habitat or woodland habitats. So it kind of they're suited to that particular environment. So that enables them to get food and enables them to survive within the habitat. So that's an example of an adaptation. For example, if we take the example of red squirrels. If we take a very common plant in Ireland, if you look out anywhere, you'll see grass. So grass is a plant. Grass is also an organism as well. It's a living thing. So grass is a plant, and it has an adaptation in its cells called chloroplasts, and which has chloroplasts have this special substance called chlorophyll, which is the green chemical. It's actually what gives color, gives grass and other green plants their color. The chloroplasts are like little machines that allow the grass to harvest the energy from the sun and turn it into food, into glucose. And this process is called photosynthesis. So you can think about these adaptations in grass, which are called chloroplasts, and this is a plant cell here, and then if you see inside the cell, you have these little structures called chloroplasts, and this is kind of like what they look like. This is a model of one of them. So you can think about them, they're like little machines, and what they do is they enable the grass to be able to harvest light from the sun, and they're able to use that light and turn it into food. So they're able to take light and combine it with water. Sorry, they're able to take um, carbon dioxide, and they're able to take water, and then using the energy from the sun, uh, they're able to harvest that energy and produce food in the form of glucose, and then they're also able to produce oxygen as well. And all of that is enabled because of this specific adaptation. They have like these special kind of pieces of machinery, if you like, that are within the cells. So the grass then is uniquely adapted to its particular environment, and it enables it to be able to get, like, it can take the light that travels, over 98 million miles from the center of our solar system through space. It comes down then on the earth, and plants, then green plants and particularly grass, is able to harvest that light and use it to make its own food and to make oxygen as well. And this is a very important process to all habitats. So, and what happens is these particular plants then, they contain, for example, glucose, and they produce oxygen. But this glucose then, if for example an organism comes along and eats the grass, it gets it's able to absorb the glucose and take the energy from the sun that the plant was able to store, for example, as glucose in its cells. So these are what are known as, so that's like what are called adaptations. So again, it's important that you know like what we mean by an adaptation, and to be able to give examples. So these here are two really good examples. So again, when organisms live within a habitat, they are competing with other organisms within the habitat. So this is what's known as competition. So one kind of local example of that would be like the red squirrel and the grey squirrel. So if we take the red squirrel, the red squirrel was in Ireland. It's a native species to Ireland, whereas the grey squirrel was not a native species. It was a foreign species that was introduced into Ireland, and it was actually introduced in Longford. So what happens after this foreign species of grey squirrels was introduced into Ireland? Once the grey squirrels kind of move into a particular area or into a habitat, they like the same habitat as the red squirrel. What happens is the number of red squirrels starts to decline within that habitat. And the reason that is because there's direct competition between these two organisms, between the grey squirrels and the red squirrels. So grey squirrels are outcompeting red squirrels. So greys outcompeting reds. So because of feeding, basically. So what happens is grey squirrels are much bigger and stronger, and they're actually able to compete for food sources, and they're able to outcompete um, the red squirrel, which is smaller and not as strong and as big as and aggressive as the grey squirrel. So this theory states that greys are better adapted to woodlands than reds, and which allows them to monopolize food resources. That means that they can completely control the food resources within the particular habitat, and as a result of that, they are able to outcompete the red squirrel for resources that are within its habitat. So this is known as competitive displacement. So what happens then is, because these grey squirrels are much better adapted to living in woodlands and they're able to outcompete. Red squirrels, they don't have enough food, so they have to move away or move out of the habitat that is occupied by the grey squirrel. So that's what's known as competition. The next thing then is this idea of what's known as interdependence. And just to kind of give you an example of this. So interdependence is where one organism depends on other organisms within their habitat. So there's this like link or dependence between them, and there's lots of different interdependence between organisms within habitats. So this allows matter, like this interdependence also, it allows matter and energy to flow through an ecosystem or habitat. So as an example of this, if we take grass, for example, so grass is able to, it's able to absorb CO2 or carbon, and it's also able to absorb calcium. So the grass has this natural ability to take this matter and it's able to absorb it. Now what happens is this grass then is like a food source, for example, for a rabbit. And what happens is the rabbit comes along and it eats the grass. And when it eats the grass, what happens is the energy and the matter that's stored in the grass, it's absorbed by the rabbit. And then what can happen then is that, so if you take the calcium and the carbon, it's absorbed by the rabbit, so it becomes part of the rabbit. Then what can happen then is that, so that rabbit then it is a food source for foxes, and then what's going to happen is the foxes are going to absorb all of this energy and matter that the rabbit has stored up, and then it's going to be part of the fox. And this process here, it's a natural process, and it allows matter and energy to flow through an ecosystem. And the energy, and grass then is able to take energy from the sun, and it's able to, um, you know, produce food, for itself, but that food also becomes food for the rabbit, and the rabbit then becomes food for the fox. So you get this movement of energy and matter through ecosystems, and this is what's known as interdependence. So again, it's important that you know what is meant by interdependence and being able to give an example of it. So this is just one example of interdependence. So the last piece then is what we can do is we can actually go out and we can study a habitat. So we can pick a particular habitat, and we're going to do this as part of our lesson. We will go and we'll conduct a habitat study. So what do we study when we go out and study? If you're like an ecologist and you go out and you study a habitat, what are some of the kind of things that you can go and study? So one thing you're going to study is, for example, you can study the organisms that are within the habitat. So you can have plants and animals and other organisms. And if you're to focus, let's say, on plants, we can carry out what's known as a quadrant study. So basically what we can do is we can pick spaces within a habitat and we can put down what's known as a quadrant. So this here is like a quadrant, it's just basically a square. And then what we can do is we can look within that square and we can identify the types of plants and animals that are within that particular section of the habitat. So this is what's known as a quadrant study. So for example, this is an example of what we mean. So in this we have, so what the person has done, they've carried out, so they've put down 10 different quadrants like this. Okay, so imagine this is one, so they would have had 10 of them all in different locations within the habitat. And then what they do is they look within the quadrant and they see, okay, are these particular plants present or not present? So for example, we can see here, if we look in quadrant 1, we can see that grass is present, the buttercup was not present, the daisy was present, the clover was not present, the dandelion was not present, and the thistle was not present. Okay, and then the person moved on to the second quadrant and carried out the same, third quadrant, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. So they were able to basically study different sections within the habitat. And then what they're able to do is they're able to tally it up and give a total, and then they're able to work out then what's known as a percentage frequency, or how often these particular plants showed up within the habitat. So you get this percentage frequency, and then you can take all of this information and you can put it into the form of a bar chart or a frequency chart that looks like this. So what we can see is within the particular habitat was studied, grass is the most common plant within that habitat, followed by daisies, followed by dandelions. So again, this is an easy way to go about and study a habitat. So you take these quadrant studies. The other thing then that you can do is we use what are called keys to identify specific organisms. So what you can do is you could take samples of your organisms. Okay, you can catch them if they are animals, or you can, if they're plants, you can take samples of their leaves. And then what you can do is you can use what's known as a key to identify those particular organisms. And we look in class at how you particularly use a key. So just as an example of this, let's say if I wanted to identify this guy here, what I can do is I can use this thing here, which is called a key. So basically there's a series of questions that you ask statements about what you're looking at. So for example, if we start here at the very first statement and it asks, so does the organism, so has it, are there legs present or legs absent? So we have a look at our organism and we can see that there's legs present, and then it tells us to go to 2, so we go down here to 2, and then it says 6 legs present or 8 legs present. Okay, so we can count the legs. So we've 1, 2, 3, so we've 6 legs present. Okay, so it says that it's an insect. Okay, so and that's, so it gives us like it's a way of identifying particular organisms. So what I would say to you is give this a go. So pause the video and have a look at each of these organisms in turn. Use the key and identify the particular organisms that you have. And some of the ways that you can collect samples within your habitat are, you can use this thing here, what's known as a pitfall trap. So basically you can dig a hole in the ground and put in a container like this, and then you can like put a, if you like, a roof on it to shelter it from the rain. And what will happen is an organism will, if it'll cross through this section here, it'll fall into the pitfall trap and then it's in here. Then what you can do is you can come along and you can take the insect or that out of the pitfall trap, and you can use it then to, you can then go and use a key like this to identify the particular organism. Another thing then is what's known as a pooter. So this is what it looks like here. So essentially what you do is you suck air through this container. So you suck air from one side, and what you can do is you can use this to suck insects into this container here, and it's what's known as a pooter, and then that enables you to study the particular organism in more detail. The last thing then that we would look at in a particular habitat are what are known as abiotic factors. So abiotic means non-living factors within a habitat. So we can look at things like the quality of the air within the particular habitat. We can look at how salty, if it's a habitat like a pond or something like that, we can take a sample of the water and see how salty the water is, determine that. We can take a sample of the soil in the habitat and carry out different studies of the soil to see what kind of soil that we have. We can simply measure the temperature at different locations within the habitat. We can look at light. So for example, are parts of the habitat shaded? Are other parts non-shaded? Like what's the light intensity at particular parts within a habitat? We can look at again, like the water that's present, and we can look and see, is it like clean water or is it polluted? You can look at things like, like samples of rocks and things like that that are in the environment. You can look at what's known as the pH. Is the soil acidic or is it basic? And you can look at things like how much rainfall you get within a particular part of your habitat. So you can measure this. You can go and put containers out and see how much rainfall you get, like let's say within a particular section of your habitat. So we will carry out a habitat study and we will look at what we have to do in relation to each of these kind of sections. But this is just giving you kind of a quick overview of like what ecology is about, and this here section here is just a quick overview of a habitat, like what factors you would study within a particular habitat as well. Okay, so hopefully that kind of gives you a quick overview of what's involved in ecology and what's involved in the study of a habitat.